So IPCC has three working groups. The one is on the science, the second is on the impact, and this one looks at the solution space. So what shall we do if we want to develop a strategy to protect ourselves against climate change?
Mitigation simply means reduction of greenhouse gas emissions.
In order to achieve carbon reduction, we have different instruments. The two major instruments are carbon efficiency, that means less carbon for energy unit, or energy efficiency, that means less energy for GDP. We have to use both instruments. In the last 20 years, we have been very efficient in the instrument number one, that means increase efficiency in the use of energy, and definitely less clever in the second instrument, which means reduce carbon content in energy supply.
If you look at the all historical emissions accumulated over since pre-industrial, the world has emitted about 2,000 billion tons of CO2, which is interesting how much we can still emit from now onwards if we want to attain 2 degrees. And still the largest responsibility is, of course, on the shoulders of the industrialized countries, mostly OECD countries, which account, as you see in this figure, for about half of the total emissions, historical emissions, are attributed to OECD. Most of the growth in emission came from developing countries in the very recent years. Especially China and Asia in general, but I would say China to the greatest extent contributed to the very large growth in emissions in the past 10 years. As you know, emissions have been growing steadily in the past 30-40 years. Traditionally they grew about 1%, 1.3% a year, but more recently in the past decade they grew as much as 2 and 2.5% per year globally. This is a huge increase in emissions. A lot of emission growth coming from developing countries can also be attributed to trade of goods which are sold from developing countries to the developed countries, industrialized countries. About 20% of emissions are attributed to trade. So 20% of emissions, for example, from China, more or less, are actually embedded in the goods that are traded and then sold abroad. The per capita emissions, there's still a lot of variety and discrepancies in per capita emissions, with countries emitting 10 to 20 billion tons of CO2 per capita per year, and countries emitting as low as 1. But things are changing rapidly. Think, for example, of China. In terms of emission standards, Chinese and Europeans are very similar now, and yet, in terms of income standards, there's still a big disparity. The biggest difference between AR5 and AR4 is that there was a lot of focus on scenarios consistent with 2 degrees. Why? Because this is a policy prescription. And these are the scenarios that, as you see here, are roughly in line with RCP 2.6. And when we look at policy, we especially focus on a specific year, which has a policy relevance and policy significance, which is 2030. This matters for negotiations, which are looking at now at post-2020. 2020 is already coming and approaching very fast. So, for example, if we take emissions that increase to above 55 billion tons of CO2 in 2030, then in order to achieve 2 degrees afterwards, we will need to reduce emissions by as much as 6% every year, which is a huge emission reduction and is completely at odds with the historical rate of actually an increase in emission of about, as I said before, 1 to 2% a year. In this case, we would need to decrease it by as much as 6%. If we were to be a bit more ambitious and be below 55, in the range maybe between 50 and 55 or even below 50, then we could achieve 2 degrees with a much lower effort. 3% emission reduction, not 6%. So this is telling you that if we delay action to 2030 to above 55 billion tons of CO2, we will need to double the effort in terms of emission reduction rates, and of course to double also the economic effort, because more emission reduction rates means also higher cost. About a cost increase quantifiable in about plus 50% of cost increase. One of the key things that we looked, of course, is what are the economic costs of achieving policies that reduce emissions at 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, and so forth. Now, the ranges vary widely across studies. If we want to achieve 2 degrees, the costs are quantified in the range between maybe 1 to 4% GDP loss in 2030 and between 2 and 6% in 2050. Lower targets in terms of higher temperatures would require much less effort. Still, these are only the cost of reducing emissions. They don't account for the benefit of reducing emissions. Of course, we are doing this because we want to have not such a warm climate, and that will have benefits by itself. And in addition to that, I should mention that these scenarios have also been shown to have potential significant co-benefits, which are not accounted in these estimates that I just mentioned, and which pertain to air pollution reduction, energy security improvement, preservation of ecosystem services, water management, and so forth. One of the key things here, who is going to bear this cost? Which regions? And there's always a tension between efficiency, achieving everything at the lowest cost possible, and equity, sharing the burden equitably. The majority of emission reduction and the majority of economic costs would fall on developing countries. The key determinant here for this is the intensity of CO2 emissions in the baseline. We can reconcile equity and efficiency by allowing for transfer across countries, payments, or through markets. Think about the Clean Development Mechanism market. And by doing so, we can achieve both efficiency and equity. However, doing so would require establishing a very large carbon market. We are talking about an order of magnitude bigger than the CDM, with transfers, a market which has the potential to deal with several billion tons of CO2 of trade, of permits, by 2030. And associated transfers of as much as $100 billion a year, which is interestingly similar to what the figures discussed in negotiations under the Green Climate Fund.
Climate change is not an environmental problem. It's not an environmental issue, but it is an economic issue, development issue. Therefore, if we want to deal with climate change, we also need to take care of poverty, of development needs in developing countries, and of the ethical dimension of climate change, that is, on the responsibility that developed countries have with respect to the situation in future impacts of climate change in developing countries. What we need to decide in the future is not how to deal with climate change, but how to deal with economic development taking into account climate change.